Content warning. This podcast episode contains discussions of a sensitive nature that may be triggering for some individuals.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's go. Diary of a Kidney Warrior podcast in partnership with Kidney Care UK, sharing faith, knowledge, hope, and love.
Hi, and welcome to Diary of a Kidney Warrior podcast. My name is Dee Moore, and I am a kidney warrior. This podcast is dedicated to encourage, educate, and inspire as we explore all aspects of kidney disease, related chronic illnesses, and health. This week, we're marking Organ Donation Week with a powerful conversation you won't want to miss. My guest today from London, England, is specialist nurse in organ donation, Lucy Dames. We'll be talking about why your choice really matters, what's changed since the law moved to an opt-out system, and the role families play in making that final decision. Along the way, we'll tackle some of the most common myths and misconceptions about organ donation and hear why saying yes can truly be life-changing for both families and recipients. So, stay tuned because this episode could change the way you think about organ donation forever. Hi, and welcome back to Diary of a Kidney Warrior podcast. How are you doing today, Lucy?
I'm good, thank you, Dee. Thank you so much for having me back on the podcast. It's great to be here.
Honestly, it is really, really my honor and pleasure to have you back on the podcast. Listeners, for those who don't already know, Lucy and we did an interview back in 2021. I mean, 4 years ago. It seems so long ago now. And this was episode 18. Gosh, so many episodes ago of Diary of a Kidney Warrior podcast. And we talked about a guide to deceased organ donation in the UK. So if you haven't yet checked out that episode, please do check out episode 18. And yeah, like I said, 4 years have passed between then and now, and so much has changed in terms of the law and policy. So I really wanted to do this interview as a follow-up from that interview and that episode to see how have things changed. Have things actually changed for the better, or have they even gotten worse since then? And examine everything that we can around organ donation. And specifically, we're going to be looking at deceased organ donation today. So our topic today is Organ Donation Week, why your choice matters. And I think it really is a topic that really does need to be talked about because, let's face it, we're talking about literally saving and changing lives. So yeah, I'm so glad to be talking to you today.
Yeah, me too. Absolutely. Organ Donation Week is here and it's a really important time for us.
So as a quick recap from where we left off, because I said at the beginning that the law has changed, but for people who aren't aware what that law is, can you quickly remind us of how the law has changed and how this has impacted organ donation?
Absolutely. So in England, in May 2020, we moved to an opt-out system of consent for organ donation. And what that means is that if you are an adult, so we mean anyone over the age of 18, if you live in England ordinarily and voluntarily, and you die in England, and at the time of your death, it's deemed that you had mental capacity, then it is assumed that you support donation. Now, for donation to go ahead in that circumstance, your family would still have to support donation going ahead. So what we need to talk about really is the importance of those family conversations around donation.
So even though there's that change in the law, if your family don't agree, even if you yourself had made that decision before, sadly, you pass, they can still override that decision.
Yes, the family play a really, really important role in donation going ahead. So as you say, even if someone has made it very clear in life that they wish to be a donor when they die, They wish to help save other people's lives, whether they've told their friends and family that verbally, whether they've written it down, or whether they've actually registered that decision on the organ donor register, because you can still register an opt-in decision. The family have the ultimate say for donation to go ahead. So that's why it's really important that your family, your loved ones, those who are going to be there in the event of your death, know what you want to have happen, because they ultimately have the final say.
So, in terms of the law change and ultimately the fact that family members have that ultimate decision, how has that impacted organ donation even after the law change?
I think what we are seeing is that we know that there is some confusion about how donation works, but I think ultimately it still comes down to the fact that the families are making a decision on donation based on what they think is the right thing to do in that moment. And obviously, we meet families when they're going through the worst day of their lives. The person that is the most important person to them usually is the person that's sadly going to die. And there's a lot of trauma with that. There's a lot of stress. There's a lot of difficulty in making important decisions during a time of grief, which is why we really want people to have those conversations when they're fit and well and healthy, or in a time where they're not making decisions in crisis. Because actually what we're seeing at the moment is that consent rates are actually not good. Families are not supporting donation as much as we would like. And sadly, the transplant waiting list is at an all-time high. We have over 8,000 people currently waiting for a transplant, which is really catastrophic. And we don't have enough donors. We don't have enough families saying yes and supporting donation, regardless of whether the patient in life had said that they wanted to be a donor or not. Unfortunately, there are still barriers to families saying yes to donation.
Is there a legal way that you can actually put in place that once you've made that decision that you would like to be an organ donor after your death, that would actually prevent anybody from stopping that happening?
You have the ability to nominate someone on your registration to be your key representative. So, for example, if you know that within your family there are mixed feelings about donation, and perhaps your parent maybe isn't supportive of donation, but your sibling is, you can register and say that you would like your sibling to be the person that ultimately makes that decision on your behalf. But ultimately, what we want, the best case scenario, is that regardless of personal feelings, the important thing is, what does the patient want? What does the person who has the potential to be a donor want? And that families are making that decision not on their own feelings and their own values, but on the values and beliefs of the person that is going to die, because that's what it's all about. It's about fulfilling wishes, because it's really sad, actually, when a patient has taken the time in life to record a decision that they want to donate and help people, and they've kept that registration up to date. Every time there's been a change in their circumstances, whether it's a change in their name or a change in their address, they've kept that registration up to date. And then we go and speak to a family and say, actually, this is what they wanted and we would like you to support that. And the family says no. That's really devastating. We will advocate for that patient, but ultimately, if that family says no, that donation won't go ahead. And what we also worry about is that those families will regret that decision 6, 12 months down the line, when in the cold light of day and the kind of mists cleared, that actually they reflect and think, oh, why did we make that decision? And it's because a lot of the time they're not making decisions when they're in a rational state of mind. But what's really important is talking about it, because sometimes patients will have registered that they want to be a donor and they've made it very clear by registering multiple times, but actually they've never told anyone. They've never had a conversation. And what families remember are those conversations. they can be quite surprised sometimes when their loved one has registered a decision if they've never discussed it. But other times they can say, oh, yes, we were sat together as a family, we were watching something on television, and we had a quick conversation, and we all knew that that's what we would want for all of us. It can be as quick as that, a few seconds, but actually that conversation has been remembered. And that's really, really powerful.
For someone who has made that decision to be an organ donor after their death, you've spoken before about it would be good for them to have a conversation with their family members. How do they go about it? What would be a good way of approaching this subject with their family members? What would be the right and good things for them to say?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I guess I can't dictate that. I think everyone's family dynamics are very different, and it often depends on the circumstances within that family and the relationships within that family. I think growing up, my mum was a nurse and my dad had been in the military, and we were always quite open as a family talking about death and dying. But for many families, that's a real taboo subject. And actually, you can equate it to the fact that in some families, the people that may be organising funerals of other family members in the future don't actually have any idea of whether their loved one would want to be buried or be cremated. We can equate it to that. I think ultimately it is an important decision, and it could be as flippant a comment as, just so there's no ambiguity, if anything ever happens to me and I'm in a situation where I can be an organ donor, I want to do that and I want you to support that. People choose to put it on their social media. Sometimes people will register and then they will put a status on their Facebook, or they'll put something on their Instagram, or they make a TikTok video. I think whatever works for you, go with it. It could be that you see something on television. It could be that you watch a medical drama and there's a storyline about donation or transplantation, or even just death and dying. I think whatever catalyst there is that can lead into that conversation, use it. I think actually what's quite surprising is that as humans, we like to talk. And although for some people it can be perceived that having conversations around death and dying are challenging, what you often find is once that cat's let out the bag, everyone wants to talk about it. And suddenly you're having a really positive conversation about funeral arrangements, decisions around donation, what music you want, those kind of things. I think it's one of those things that actually we all know we're going to die. It's an inevitability of being a human, that we are mortal and we are all going to die, and we have to face up to that. So I think sometimes a catalyst to those sort of conversations might be a death within the family. And that often, I've been to funerals where going to a funeral starts people talking about what funeral they would like. A bit like you go to a wedding and you say, oh, I wouldn't have those flowers at my wedding, or I wouldn't have that music to walk down the aisle. Whatever works. I think the most important thing is that if you know you want to donate, it's make that decision known, record it, whatever method, record it on the NHS donor register, record it via the NHS app, write it in a document, but share it, shout it from the rooftops, whatever method works. I think that's the really important thing, is actually sharing that decision, because as I say, sometimes we have patients that have very clearly registered a decision, but when we present that to their family, they had no idea and they're quite surprised, and actually they don't feel that just having that registration document is enough.
Do you think it would be helpful to have something more personalized? So, for example, writing a short letter to the individual family members, if they're married, to their wife or husband, if they're not married and living at home, to their parents, dear mom, dear dad, that actually says that they would like to be a donor. Do you think something personalized would actually help?
I don't think it would hurt. I think, again, it just comes down to how relationships are in that family. I mean, obviously, a lot of people join the donor register when they get a driving license for the first time. And quite often they are younger when they get a driving license, and it might be that they are away from home. So perhaps in those circumstances, writing home to kind of inform the family may well be beneficial. I think we don't write many letters nowadays, so actually the weight behind them is probably quite powerful. And I think actually saying, I want you to support this in whatever method is the key, because we know that families have mixed views on all sorts of things. You know, we don't like the same foods. We don't necessarily have the same political beliefs. We don't always have the same religious beliefs within a family unit. But it's ultimately about your values as a person and your values as a family. And I don't think anyone would really ever want to go against what their loved one wants to have happen to them when they die. But it's the not knowing that causes the problems. And usually when someone hasn't registered a decision or remain neutral to thoughts around donation, the default of a family is to say no to donation.
I want to look at the kind of reasons why people may say no. And I've seen many different, what people would say, conspiracy theories as to why people wouldn't agree to organ donation for their loved one. And this can be quite a difficult thing to address, but I think it really is important that we take the time to address, especially as they're such a barrier for people. So the first one that I read online and that I've seen and that people have talked about is, if I register to be an organ donor on my driver's license, it will make me a target and they will deliberately bump me off, so to speak, so they can get my organs. What would you say to people who say that?
I mean, I've heard that myself, and I've seen statements to that effect on social media. Doctors won't try hard enough to save me if I'm on the register. And frankly, that's not only untrue, it's dangerous. It's stopping lives being saved, because ultimately the medical teams that care for patients coming into hospitals have a duty of care to save lives. And ultimately, we are only involved when it's evident that despite the best efforts of the team involved in caring for that patient, they are going to die. That is when we are involved, and we are a completely separate team to the hospital team. We, the organ donation specialists, the specialist nurses in organ donation across the country, we're not employed by the hospitals directly. We are brought in when we are needed to support families at end of life. So I think that's really important. I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge that some communities carry historic mistrust in healthcare. And if we don't acknowledge that, we won't ever be able to change it. I think we know trust is built when we show respect, and we have to make it very clear that ultimately the care of your loved one is what comes first at all costs. Rituals are honoured. Every patient is treated as an individual. And as I say, it is only when it is very evident to all involved that sadly, despite the best efforts of everyone, that patient cannot be saved, but donation is an option, that we will consider speaking to families about donation. And I think that's really, really important, because I can understand the fear behind that, but it's just simply not the case. And as I say, perpetuating that myth is really dangerous.
Another concern that I've heard online is that people say that the patient isn't really dead and that they lie about the person being dead so that they can get the organs. What would you say to people that say that?
I think that it's very worrying that people have concerns that they wouldn't be dead when their organs are removed. In deceased organ donation, there are very strict criteria to ascertain the suitability of a donor. Organs are never removed from a potential donor until they're dead. And the diagnosis of death is carried out by a medical team that is entirely separate to the donation and transplant team. There are two ways that someone can be legally declared dead in the UK, whether that's death confirmed by neurological criteria. So this usually happens if someone is in the intensive care department. They've had a very significant brain injury through, for example, an accident or maybe a brain hemorrhage or a stroke. And then two very senior doctors have to perform independently a set of tests to confirm that that patient has died and that the brain is irreversibly damaged and will not work again. They carry out those tests after acknowledging a lot of preconditions of suitability. So these are patients that will have been cared for many hours and days before they get to that point. Or the more common and well-known method of confirming death, which is that when patients' hearts have stopped, they are observed for a period of 5 minutes to make sure that they are not breathing, that their heart's no longer beating, and then they can be declared dead. And as I say, these tests and these observations are carried out by healthcare professionals that are entirely separate from the donation team. The retrieval surgeons who perform the operation don't go anywhere near the patient until after that patient has died. And I think that's really important for people to recognize that these are two entirely separate scenarios. The criteria for diagnosing death is standardized, whether you're declaring dead in a hospital, in a home, in a hospice. It's entirely separate.
You mentioned that there's laws around declaring someone dead, and I know that laws can be very long, very complicated, but can you, in brief, in summary, describe what the law actually says in terms of making sure that the person is actually deceased before any organs are taken from them?
Yes, so the criteria for death is written into UK law and it's written into professional medical guidelines around the diagnosis of death. So in the UK, the law recognises death in two ways. It recognises brainstem death, which is the irreversible loss of all brain function, including the brainstem, which is the part of the brain that essentially holds our capacity for consciousness, for breathing, etc. Or circulatory death, which is when we think more about someone's heart stopping. So a more well-known method of death. And once death is confirmed under either of these definitions, a person is then legally dead, even if they may remain on a ventilator, keeping, for example, organs supplied with blood. They can still be legally dead. So essentially, we have to consider that the medical team that are declaring someone dead are separate from the donation team and they're separate from the transplant team. They will be the healthcare professionals who've been caring for that patient and ultimately decide that this patient is at end of life or the patient dies in an uncontrolled manner. Then a healthcare professional who is trained to declare someone dead will go through the steps to do that. And it's only then that any organs that are able to be donated would be donated.
Now that we've addressed the misinformation and conspiracy theories that are out there that are against organ donation, I really want to focus on the benefits of organ donation. And I think that it's a very difficult time when you're grieving the loss of your loved one to be making these kind of decisions to say, yes, I want to give consent. But I think that it would be good to actually talk about what would be the benefits of that yes. And I want to start with the actual family, the grieving family. What are the benefits for the family for them to agree to their loved one's organs to be donated?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question because I think we all understand that with donation going ahead, hopefully lives are going to be saved, transplants are going to go ahead, and patients will walk away from organ failure. which is ultimately the goal. But for the donor families, what we hear from, I've worked in this field a long time now. Families take real comfort in knowing that something positive has come from what is usually quite an unexpected and tragic situation. A lot of patients that go on to become organ donors have had a very unexpected death, quite often a traumatic death. Family may have been present when the patient was first brought into hospital, and it's a roller coaster for them. They are dealing with the shock, they're dealing with the grief. They're quite often quite short time frames, but they're coming to terms with the situation. And then they're presented with an option of donation. And as I say, if they don't know what their loved one wanted, that can be really difficult. And it's more often than not the default is to say no. But when they say yes, they do really take comfort from the fact that actually something positive is coming from this. And for many families, they don't actually want to know which organs end up being donated, and they don't want to know any information about where those organs have gone. They're just comforted to know that something positive has happened. But for others, that's really important. They'd like to know which organs have been donated and a little bit about the recipients. It's always very anonymized, but they like to know that organs have been transplanted because that's what they really hold on to. And I think what we have to try and do as specialist nurses when we're supporting these families is to try and get them to a point of thinking about how they may feel 6-12 months down the line, because at the moment when they're making these decisions or they are in that situation, it's very hard for them to kind of think how they're going to feel down the line. But when we meet families later on, they are generally very, very comforted knowing that donation has gone ahead, transplants have gone ahead successfully, positive outcomes have happened, because it really helps them through their grief. And I think that's so important because these patients were going to die regardless. And I think that's really, really important. We often hear transplant patients saying that they feel a real burden that a patient has had to die, but they haven't had to die. They were going to die because of what happened to them or what circumstance brought them into hospital, sadly, that was going to lead to their death. But they haven't died in order to help others. They've died in spite of that, and donation is just a positive outcome of that.
You briefly touched on this when you spoke before, but I want to really focus more on it now, which is what is the benefit of organ donation for the recipient?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I work on the donation side, but I have the benefit of coming into contact with recipients through promotional events and obviously working alongside closely with recipient coordinator nurses. And I think it's ultimately life-changing. There are certain organs that there is no way of bridging a gap. If they go into organ failure, they need an organ. And for other patients like yourself, there may be adjuncts to transplant, for example, dialysis. But as you well know, being a patient on dialysis is not living a normal life. It affects your ability to hold down a job. It affects your ability to travel. It affects what you eat and drink. It's a huge disruptor. You don't have a normal life. So being able
Absolutely.
to, so
Absolutely agree with that one.
being able to have a transplant is transformative. It's giving people life back. I think it's really important to acknowledge that transplantation is not a silver bullet. Transplantation still comes with additional healthcare needs. Patients need anti-rejection medications, for example, and sometimes there can be complications with those medications. But regardless, for most people, having a transplant is entirely transformative and life-saving, and there is no quick fix. And sadly, for many people who need a transplant, they won't get one because there are just not enough organs and there are not enough people saying yes. And we have to also have patients donating organs that are a good match for patients waiting for transplants. And that's also really important. We know, for example, that patients from Black and Asian backgrounds wait longer, not because their lives matter less, but because there are fewer donors from their own communities. A child with kidney failure is going to wait longer simply because fewer families of the same ethnicity say yes, fewer parents of children say yes to donation. This isn't an abstract concept. People are dying every single day. We have to make changes and we have to think much more positively about helping other people. We can't just be a nation of takers. We have to think very seriously if we'd be willing to accept an organ to save our own life or that of a loved one. We must also be prepared to give an organ, whether it's our own or that of a loved one. As a population, we're getting fatter. We're not as healthy as we don't have as physical jobs as maybe our parents or our grandparents had. So we're more likely to develop conditions like high blood pressure or diabetes. And these are conditions that we know can lead directly to kidney failure. So the reality is that we could very well need a transplant ourselves. And wouldn't we want that organ to be available for us? So if we are willing to accept an organ, we have to be willing to give.
I think it really comes down to that, doesn't it? If you're willing to accept an organ, then yes, you should be willing to give an organ. I think that's a very strong message that I really do want to reiterate.
Yeah, I mean, we hear, I've approached families and the default is no, and the response is we don't donate. What does that we mean? Is it that we've never talked about it? Then if that's the case, let's encourage these conversations. Again, what are the values? What does it mean to help save others? There may be people who believe that donation is against their religion, but we know that that's not the case. All major religions in the UK support donation, that we know that the act of giving and saving a life is compassion and charity that all religions, major religions support. So if you don't know whether your religion supports donation, then go and find out. Go and look up information and help you to have these conversations and think positively about donation, because sadly, people are dying every single day and it's a reality. It's staring us in the face. And I think the other thing is that actually more and more people are having complications because of conditions that I've previously mentioned. And it might well be the case that we know people who are waiting for transplant. We just don't know we know.
You spoke earlier about the number of people that are actually waiting the various transplant lists, which sadly is thousands of people across the UK.
Mm-hmm.
But do you have any statistics or numbers of the amount of times when families have been approached and asked whether they're willing for their loved ones' organs to be donated, whether they've said yes or whether they've said no?
I mean, the consent rates for organ donation are monitored weekly. As an organisation, we look continually at the reasons why families say yes to donation and the reasons why, conversely, they say no. These consent rates fluctuate massively, but overall, it's probably sadly just over a third of families approach that actually say yes to donation, which is not as many as we would like, obviously. And as I say, we know that the most likely source of consent or the most likely positive outcome is when a patient has said that they want to donate. They've made it very clear to their loved ones and they've registered that decision. in those circumstances, then we know that families are much more likely, around 98% of the time, they will say yes to donation. But otherwise, we're talking about 50-50, 40 to 50% of the time, families will say yes, which is not enough. These patients are dying, organs are being buried and burnt. And in the meantime, more and more people are being listed. As I say, we have over 8,000 people currently on the active transplant waiting list for varying organs, the highest of which are those waiting for a kidney transplant. But sadly, we don't have enough donors. Last year, we had just over 1,400 donors in the whole of the UK. And obviously, one person can donate more than one organ. One donor has the potential to donate up to 9 organs. So they have the potential to help save many, many lives. But it all starts with the yes. That's the key. The families have to support the donation going ahead. And that's why it all comes down to conversations and making it very clear that you want to help people. And again, you have to think about your values. You have to think about what's most important in that moment. You have to think about, will this help us get through this grief? Will this help us to acknowledge that this death wasn't in vain? And will it also fit with the values of our loved one? You know, our loved one was really generous, was really kind, was a really giving person. Then absolutely, this is, this fits completely with how they were as a person in life. And also, we want to be able to help other people, because we know if the shoe was on the other foot and we could say, actually, there's this wonder drug or there's this operation that we can do that can save your loved one's life, you would absolutely want to take that, wouldn't you? So knowing that we can't help these patients that are going to die, we can help other people. I think the other thing that's really important, Dee, is that it's actually the amount of people that have the potential to be donors in their death are very low. It's only about 1% of people that die in a circumstance that actually would enable them to be donors in the first place. And I don't think people realize that either, which is why there's perhaps a feeling that it doesn't really matter if I say no because the next family will say yes. But we're talking about very, very small, a very small number of people that die in a circumstance that can donate. We have around 600,000 deaths a year, and 1% of them will die in a hospital on a ventilator whereby they could donate organs. And then you bring in the fact that consent comes into it and a family has to support that. You shrink that number even more. And then you factor in, is the patient suitable? Does the patient have any medical conditions that would preclude them? You're getting a smaller and smaller pool, which is why every single yes is so important. Every single donor is so precious. And that's also why every single donor is so well cared for and treated with the utmost dignity and respect, because we know how precious these patients and these organs are. They're literally life-saving.
Another thing that I'm aware of is misconceptions around people who think that they can't be an organ donor for whatever reason, whether they think they're too old or whether they've had a certain illness that they think means they can't donate. So can you address those misconceptions?
Yeah, definitely. Again, that's something that I hear quite frequently. Some people are supportive of donation but don't register themselves as donors because, like you say, either they think they might be too old to donate organs, or they may have had an illness, they may have had some form of cancer or some such in the past, and they think that that precludes them donating. And I think what I would say is if anyone has concerns about suitability to donate, then you can speak to a specialist nurse in organ donation, but ultimately just register your decision, because that really is for us to ascertain suitability. And the goalposts move all the time. I've been doing this job well over a decade now, and even in that time, the advances in organ retrieval and post retrieval preservation allow us to consider donors that we wouldn't have done, say, 10 or 20 years ago. Patients that maybe had high risk infections, etc., who weren't suitable to donate years ago now are suitable to donate. So I would just say that if you know you want to help people, just register that and allow us to ascertain suitability, because things change all the time. And the other thing is, ultimately, if someone is desperately in need of a transplant and an organ is the only thing that is going to save them, their surgeons and their healthcare team will assess the risk of the condition of the donor or what history the donor may have versus the risk of not transplanting that patient at that time and waiting. Because as we know, there aren't enough organs, and it may well be that if they don't take that risk or that opportunity, another organ won't come in time before that patient dies. So yeah, I would just say, don't worry whether you're suitable to donate or not. Just make your wishes known, and then as healthcare professionals, we can ascertain suitability. I think there may sometimes be some confusion if people have been told that they can't donate blood for a specific healthcare condition that they may have. But blood donation has very different contraindications to organ donation. So again, I've heard that when I've been at events and people have said, oh, no, I can't donate. I've been told I can't donate. And when I've digged a little bit deeper, it's actually that they've been told they can't donate blood. But the condition or the reason that they've been told that would not stop them donating organs. So I think it's really important that people don't worry about their own suitability and they just make their wishes known. That's the most important thing.
Today, Lucy, we have explored the topic of Organ Donation Week, why your choice matters. We've looked specifically today at deceased organ donation, the change in the law, the impact of the choices of families. We've talked about conspiracy theories, the benefits for the family for organ donation, the benefits of the recipient for organ donation. We've looked at the type of conversations that need to happen in order for more organ donations to go ahead. From your experience of working as an organ donation nurse, what more can be done to encourage conversations?
I think conversations around organ donation have to happen at home. They have to happen. We meet these families when they're going through crisis, and more often than not, they have an opinion on donation that is compounded by the stress and trauma of what they're going through. And as I said, the reflex is often to say no. So I think what needs to happen is that conversations need to happen in the communities, in life and in positive circumstances. We need more champions to talk about donation experiences. So if people have donated their loved ones' organs and would be willing to share that, we need them to share those stories. We need to put a face to the reality of donation and not make it taboo. We need people to talk about experiences of waiting for transplants, like yourself, the challenges of waiting for that organ and the benefits when those transplants go ahead. But I think we just need to get more people talking, and representation matters. We need community champions. We need people sharing those stories. Communities need proof, not promises. We as healthcare professionals can share these narratives time and again, but actually we need to break down barriers and build trust. And the best way to do that is from within communities.
For people who have more questions, who are looking for more information, where can they get that information?
The best place for people to go to get more information, find out things about the donation process, around donation and their faith and beliefs, or the opt-out system, the role of the family, is to visit the organ donation website. And the address for that is www.organdonation.nhs.uk. There's lots of information and facts on there for people to explore. And also, they can go there to register their donation decision.
And as always, I will put the links in the description box. So please do check out the website, check out the information, and empower yourself and your families with this knowledge. My final question is, what is your final word of encouragement for the listeners?
Well, I would say don't leave it unsaid. Think about your donation decision, register that decision, and talk to your loved ones. But think very, very carefully about that decision, and think about, if you needed a transplant, would you want an organ to be available? If so, then you should be willing to give. So please register a decision to donate and tell everyone. Shout it from the rooftops.
Thank you so much for joining me again. Thank you so much for the information that you've shared. I really hope that this helps to raise awareness and increase those life-changing and life-saving yes.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on again, and hopefully we can save more lives.
Thank you for listening to Diary of a Kidney Warrior podcast. I truly appreciate your support. New episodes of this podcast are released every other Monday, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you found this episode helpful, why not share it with someone who might benefit too? To stay up to date with the latest episodes, news and resources, sign up for the email mailing list and join the WhatsApp channel. All the details are in the episode description. Until next time, take care and choose to live.